everyone, and welcome to Immersive Inclusion, Harnessing the Power of AR/VR for Good in DEI. My name is Ellysse. I'm a policy analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, where I focus on issues at the intersection of AR/VR and public policy. We have a great panel with us today to discuss the potential that these technologies have to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, as well as the way developers, policymakers, and civil society can mitigate potential harms for vulnerable and marginalized communities. Before I introduce our topic and this expert panel, a couple of housekeeping notes. First, please note this session is being recorded and anything we say here is on the record and attributable. So just keep that in mind as the conversation unfolds. Second, we do want this to be a conversation not just among the panelists, but also with you, our guests. If you have a question for our panelists, please add it to the chat and we will get to as many as we can over the course of our discussion. Our panelists today are leading the growing effort to understand how immersive technologies can have a positive impact on equity and inclusion across sectors. We have Lydia X.E. Brown, who is a policy counsel with the Privacy and Data Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, where they focus on disability rights and algorithmic fairness and justice. Doan is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland and the associate director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research. His lab develops and deploys virtual reality to study implicit racial bias in policing, using VR to balance realism and validity in experimental studies to hone in on race as a causal factor in differential outcomes in policing. And soon to join us, we will also have Courtney Cogburn, who is an associate professor at Columbia University, whose research includes exploring how virtual reality experiences can lead to changes in attitudes, social perception, and engagement. She's the lead creator of the immersive virtual reality experience 1000 Cut Journey. Welcome to our speakers. So augmented and virtual reality and the immersive experiences they generate present unique opportunities to enhance diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. At the same time, this same immersive nature of these technologies can present safety, accessibility, and bias challenges for vulnerable and marginalized users and their communities. Striking this balance between realizing the full potential of these technologies and mitigating the potential for harm is crucial to expand their user base and ensure immersive experiences are accessible, secure, and enjoyable for as many people as possible. ITIF recently released a report titled AR/VR for Equity and Inclusion: How to Unlock the Potential of Augmented and Virtual Reality to Reduce Barriers and Expand Opportunity. Drawing from the interviews with stakeholders in the equity and inclusion space, the 3 reports in the series looked at the opportunities that AR/VR present to reduce barriers and enhance inclusion, the risks and challenges these technologies present for underserved communities, and the recommendations for developers, policymakers, and implementing organizations to ensure the future of AR/VR across sectors is accessible and inclusive. There were 3 takeaways from these reports that I want us to keep in mind as this conversation unfolds. First, any effort to build inclusive AR/VR should integrate the lived experiences of underrepresented and impacted groups from the outset and across the product development and implementation process. Second, developers and implementing organizations should take advantage of the highly customizable nature of virtual experiences to give users control over everything from accessibility accommodations to how they represent themselves in virtual space. And finally, any efforts to build AR/VR for inclusion should take a holistic approach to inclusivity, considering factors such as internet access, and offer accessible and equally valuable real-world alternatives. With that, let's kick off our conversation today by learning more about the fantastic work our panelists are doing. Lydia, let's start with you. AR/VR use cases span across sectors and industries, from augmenting public services to enhancing virtual collaboration. Based on your work on the impacts of other emerging technologies, how do you think widespread adoption of AR/VR in areas such as education, government, or the workplace might impact disability rights?
This is Lydia. Seemingly contradictorily, but not actually, widespread adoption of AR and VR technologies both offers the opportunity to vastly increase access and remove barriers for many disabled people, including many multiply marginalized disabled people, to be able to access education, the workforce, or public services, and simultaneously threatens our continued access to such spaces and our ability to be treated and considered as whole humans and to be afforded the full spectrum of our civil and political and human rights. And let me break that down a little bit. For many disabled people, there are numerous barriers to being able to access services, work, school, or the community in person. And for those of us who, in some cases, are affected in that category, the increase of virtual learning, virtual work, and virtual entertainment and community building opportunities during the pandemic was a boon. To be able to not have to worry about unreliable or inaccessible transportation, not have to worry about the availability of a personal care attendant or support person, to not have to worry about whether an event would include heavy chemical or artificial fragrances that could sicken a person, whether there would be the presence of seizure-inducing flashing or strobing lights, to worry about whether or not it would zap all of a person's energy for the entire week just to spend one evening at a restaurant with friends, or going to one social services office, or going to see the doctor, or going to work, and then having absolutely no energy left outside of the minimal amount needed to do that work during the week. Being able to access those types of spaces virtually has decreased that loss of energy and reliance on inaccessible and sometimes dangerous modes of support or transportation that we are often left to rely upon to participate in person spaces. But by the same token, the vast majority of technologies, programs, tools, and softwares that we see brought into the world now do not take into account what it means for disabled people to be able to use them on an equal basis with others, especially for disabled people who are at the margins of the margins. We already know, for example, that automated facial recognition is highly unreliable for trans people, for people of color, whether Black, Brown, Native, or Asian, that such softwares cannot necessarily be used reliably for people who aren't already in the white male able-bodied category. So to think about what it means to expand those technologies and adoption into other spaces also raises those vital questions of how will this adoption further jeopardize our existing access and exacerbate deprivation of access, as well as exacerbate discrimination. And I know that we're going to talk about this in a lot greater detail, but just to lay that out, that is to say that disabled people face both certain opportunities and the threatened and actual loss of opportunities. Because of the pandemic, there were many disabled people who lost the opportunity to be able to receive necessary care, to be able to socialize with friends and loved ones, to be able to participate in the community in the same way as non-disabled people, to be able to work, or to be able to learn. So just as many of us have benefited from increased virtual and remote access, many of us also lost vital access to the community around us. That is where we are headed.
Great, thank you, Lydia. Long, let's go to you. Your lab has done some interesting work merging social science and VR to develop immersive trainings for police officers. How do you translate VR experiences into actionable feedback or behavioral change?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think broadly speaking, the lab is interested in, has been doing a lot of work over the past few years in incorporating VR technology in training efforts, across various fields. Policing is the area that I'm currently focused on, but some of our work in this domain has included training for job interviews, or training on bystander interventions with bullying of kids. So I think there's a lot of potential for this technology as it relates to the police. We have two sort of domains that we tap into, and the first being the actual police civilian training, and the focus of what we do is put police officers in immersive situations that mimic the field in more realistic ways than what they're accustomed to doing. And in doing that, we can have them interact with live, semi-live, pre-recorded, but live VR characters that respond to them and are adaptive to what they're saying. And we can use that training to play back what they did and sort of compare their performance across various scenarios to give them feedback on how to better interact with community, how to de-escalate situations, and how to use a different side of their training, because a lot of officers, when they come through our program, talk about how the bulk of their training is tactical. They're really good at learning how to, take weapons away from people, or how to put an end to conflicts that escalate, but they don't get as much training on just normal human interaction. So we view this as a way to put them in a realistic enough scenario that they can apply it to the field and take these experiences out to the field with them, but also in the safety of a lab, where they don't feel like their life's in danger, or they don't feel like they have to, necessarily deploy any weapons or anything like that. The other domain that we use this VR technology in is to study implicit racial bias in policing. So because these VR characters are created in a lab, we can vary characteristics about the characters to examine in an immersive environment whether and how police officers interact with these characters differently, how the situations may evolve or devolve in various ways based on the characteristics of the civilians that they're interacting with. We can also vary things about the scenarios that they're in, and have those scenarios be adaptive to them. And because they're in a lab setting, we can measure a host of outcomes that we can't really do with real world data. So we can measure their physiology. We could video record how they're interacting, and have human coders go through and look at their body language. So it opens up a lot of potential both for the applied side of police training, and making sure that officers are getting adequate training to de-escalate situations to prevent tragedies from happening in the real world, but also we view it as a way to improve the state of the art in terms of measurement and experimentation, and looking at outcomes that are of interest to scholars as well as practitioners.
Great. There's so much exciting work on this panel. I'm really looking forward to diving in more on some of this. So let's start with a general question, and let's start on the optimistic side of this issue. For anyone, where do you think AR/VR has the greatest potential to make a positive impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion? Maybe not necessarily, something as specific as your work long, but some general areas and strengths that you think these technologies have. Long, let's kick it to you.
Yeah, I can jump right in. I think the area that has the most potential, and some of your questions allude to this, is in perspective taking. There's a lot of research, especially in the bias field, that having participants go through immersive scenarios where they can embody somebody else and experience things that are not something that they experience in everyday life, can lead to attitude changes in a way that just imagining it can't, right? So I always think of the scenario of, talking to a kid, and, you can rationalize with the kid, or you can explain how something that they do has an effect on other people. And, it doesn't even have to be a kid. Like, I do this too, right? Like, you can imagine how different scenarios will play out, but unless you're going through that scenario and you're experiencing the emotions and the stressors that come with going through that scenario, you don't really quite know. And the cool thing about VR is, even though, like, before you put on the goggles or whatnot, that it's fake. Once you're in it and once you're immersed, and we get this feedback from pretty much everyone who goes through any of our programs, once you're like suspend disbelief for a little bit, and once you're in the scenarios, you feel it. And with the police work, when we have heart rate sensors on the officers and they're going through a scene, their heart rate goes up. Like it's realistic enough to mimic real life in a way that other technologies can't. And because of that, I think it has a lot of potential for equity and inclusion, because you can now play the role of the other. You can now have people who probably due to their positionality or the identities that they hold will never actually face circumstances that others face. And once you put them in that, hopefully they will become more empathetic and understand how people from different walks of life go through or feel or experience. And as a result, maybe we'll have a kinder, better world. I don't know, like that's the optimistic side of it. So I'm curious what others think.
Yeah, Courtney, why don't we pass it over to you, since this is really your area as well. Can you give us a little overview of your work and your perspective on this particular advantage?
Sure. Hi everyone. Sorry to join late. I think, where I started in VR was really about like perspective taking and empathy. And I think VR can be quite powerful in that way, but I've also moved in a direction, and I think it's tricky in VR, but I've moved in a direction of thinking about how to represent systems and structures. So how can I help people understand the ways in which racial inequities emerge? And that doesn't exist only at the individual level, that exists in policy, that exists in the ways in which we structure neighborhoods and schools, etc. So in the project that we're working on now is really trying to think about, can we visualize structural racism, leveraging the qualities of VR? Can we help people see how a policy decision can change a physical environment over time, or differentially affect different bodies in a space, so that we can understand that the choices that we're making at this the policy level has important implications and can differentially impact people, particularly on the basis of race. So I think I don't want us to only focus on empathy and can I understand this single perspective, which is certainly where a lot of my work has started, but also thinking about, can we start to see patterns in society? Can we start to sort of add up how this equates to inequity? Because ultimately the DEI efforts are rooted in an attempt to, or should be rooted in an attempt to address inequities in systems. And so we have to understand the roots of those inequities. How did we get here? What's producing the inequity, in order to be effective at doing something about it. So I and I hope others are sort of thinking about how we are to help people see and understand that as well.
Great point. Thank you, Courtney. And I'd just like to remind everyone, if you have questions for our panelists about their work or anything they reference, please feel free to drop that in the chat and we'll try to get to them later on in this discussion. Lydia, did you have any thoughts on empathy and perspective taking while we're on this topic?
This is Lydia. One thing that I'm actually very concerned about with the increased use of both AR and VR technologies is the rush by which so many researchers want to use these technologies to train or teach disabled people to be able to have social skills or soft skills in the workplace. They'll often talk about it as, and not consider how usually we're the ones facing discrimination. We don't need to learn better social skills to not be discriminated against. Non-disabled people, white people, people of wealth privilege need to be learning better social skills. But especially for people with my particular disability, I'm autistic, there's this widespread belief that we just need to be fixed somehow, therapized, and the technology will teach us better how to interact with people so that we can be better, more functional humans, when in reality, we're facing deprivation of access to healthcare, deprivation of access to the workforce, deprivation of access to school, not because of how we interact with the world, but because of how the world perceives us and because of how the world interacts with us. And so I hope that as we have conversations about recognizing humanity and creating more opportunities for people to practice and hone their skills with empathy, that extends to those people who hold more power and privilege, and is not simply repeating a cycle of expecting marginalized people to somehow have to develop skills to not be marginalized anymore, when that wasn't actually our responsibility to begin with.
Lydia, I couldn't agree more. When we think about DEI efforts are often targeted, the efforts are often targeted to the marginalized and oppressed groups. and to somehow fix them. And you really need to think about the dominant group that's causing the problem, that's producing the toxicity in the first place. Target your efforts to teaching them how to not produce the toxicity, and think about your policies and how they're producing barriers for these groups of people. Because ultimately, if you get out of the way of marginalized people, they'll be just fine. They don't need to be fixed. You need to get out of their way. And so I think when we're thinking about DEI more broadly, that has to be the focus. Too often we're trying to fix the Black people, we're trying to fix the women, we're trying to fix the people with disabilities, instead of fixing the systems that are in their way and getting in the way of their progress. So I agree 100%.
Yeah, I also agree 100%. And I think, you know, empathy cuts both ways. And the perspective taking, I think the focus has to be on dominant group members and having them understand the perspective of marginalized communities, and understand like what it feels like to be discriminated against, and understand what it feels like to face structural barriers that you really, like the powerlessness that comes with that. And until they do, I don't think they're going to get out of the way. So, you know, I think the training, you know, like you said, Lydia, shouldn't be focused on, you know, how do you develop skills to exist. It should be focused on how do you train people who have no real impetus to learn other people's perspectives. Like, how do you force them to be more empathetic and be more supportive and be better allies? And, you know, I'm curious, especially at, you raised, Courtney, the point that like a lot of your work is focused on, a lot of your current work is focused on like showing people structural racism. And I'm curious how you're developing that, because I'm, you know, that's really interesting. And, you know, how do you take it beyond the individual level? Because that's sort of the issue that I'm having. Like it unnecessarily makes the focus on individual interactions or individual dyads or whatnot, but like, how do you scale that up to look at systems of oppression?
And Long, I think there's two pieces to that, right? There's understanding the perspectives and experiences of marginalized and oppressed people. But another piece that I think we don't examine enough in this space is, do you understand your experience as a member of the dominant group, right? So in my work around racism and creating this piece where you become a Black man and, you know, taking on this perspective of a Black man, that's not actually an experience about a Black experience. That's an experience of white racism. So part of what we've been considering is like, how do I make whiteness visible to you? How do I make white supremacy visible to you? How do I make your position as a member of the dominant group and what that means and how that translates for you? And I think that's another piece of the puzzle that's really important for us to examine and try and represent. In terms of structural racism, the way we're really in the early stages of developing this, but we're really trying to think about, can we visualize how a housing policy decision or an educational policy decision transforms a physical environment, or there are different bodies standing on the street that are differentially impacted by that choice. You might think about stop and frisk, right, in New York City. Different bodies in different neighborhoods have different experiences with that policy decisions, and can we visualize that in VR in some way? And so that's part of how we're trying to do it, but it's tough. It's tough. It's much easier and not easy at all, right? To think about you are this person taking on this perspective and this experience, but to try and represent patterns and systems is another kind of complicated level of using VR that I think is worth exploring, but is quite tricky.
So before we move on from this empathy and perspective taking aspect, which I think is one of the most important things that we need to figure out now, as more and more companies are looking to this as a solution, you know, there are several advocates who have raised concerns about relying too heavily on empathy and perspective taking when it comes to DEI and these kinds of trainings. So I'd be curious to get your thoughts, you know, where would you draw the line between an effective intervention that could actually address some of these systemic issues and potentially harmful activities that could entrench bias or harm the communities that are meant to be represented in these experiences?
I can jump in. I have a lot of tensions around this in terms of VR and empathy and racial empathy in particular. And I just have concerns that it's not possible, right? It's not possible for you to really have empathy around what it's like to be a Black person living in the United States. And I don't think VR can actually get you to that point. And I think even if it were possible, it's not sufficient. So you're feeling bad about something, or feeling that it's just awful that that person is going through this, and I feel terrible about that, doesn't necessarily translate into behavior or action or analysis. Am I analyzing problems of race differently as a result of going through this VR experience, or did I just cry at the end of the thing that I went through? And so I think we have to think very carefully about what is the actual target? What is the goal that we're trying to reach when we're putting people in a headset? Are we trying to make them feel emotions? And are we also trying to get them to act differently? And that might have implications for our design. That might have implications for what we choose to put in the VR experience. And I think ultimately when we're thinking about VR in relation to social impact and VR in relation to DEI, we want to be thinking about, when I'm presented with a new unfamiliar problem related to the issue that I'm trying to address, does this person have some new insight that they're going to apply to that? Or have they transferred some knowledge or skill? Are they behaving differently as a result of what they've gone through in VR? And I think related to that, we can't put all the weight on the VR experience. VR is only capable of so much. There are things that need to happen when people come out of the headset. So I think we should be thinking about not only what experiences are we creating in the headset, but what are the complementary activities that are happening outside the headset as well.
This is Lydia. I would add to that. Firstly, I agree with what you're talking about, but I want to add more specifically that there are decades of research about what are called disability simulations, which used to be low tech and now might be becoming high tech with the increasing availability of AR, VR technologies, where the theoretical purpose of a disability simulation is to stimulate empathy for disabled people by asking a non-disabled person to pretend to be blind for an hour or a day by putting on a blindfold and closing their eyes, or asking someone who doesn't have a physical disability to use a wheelchair for a day or for a week or something, and so on and so forth. And many of us as disabled people have written for decades and decades about how harmful these simulations are, and our work is backed up by psychological research, which demonstrated that in the use of any simulation exercise, people who participated afterward reported feeling greater feelings negatively toward disabled people, such as feelings of pity, feelings of distaste, feelings of discomfort, and that even those who were able to express verbally that they had a bit of a better understanding of certain struggles that disabled people faced, they all spoke about it in the context of experiencing a bodily loss or a tragedy, which can happen, especially for people who become later disabled in their life. They weren't born disabled, especially because of societal ableism, that if you become disabled in a way that you weren't before, you may feel a sense of loss or tragedy because society teaches us that disability is bad and suffering. But for many disabled people, we've been disabled for our entire lives or for a very long time. And I don't experience it as a loss of something I never had that I am disabled. And so even when people who experience these simulations reported, I understand better that stairs are a problem, they spoke about it through the language of individual burden, which does the opposite of promoting greater understanding of and ability to examine and to respond to systems and structures of oppression. And as disabled activists and advocates, we speak about the issues that disabled people face as largely caused by ableism, that is a system of power relations and structural oppression that deprives disabled people of the same rights, equality, access, opportunity, and justice as non-disabled people, a system that acts in tandem with other forms of oppression and marginalization, white supremacy, settler colonialism, patriarchy, and all of the other ways that people move through society and are impacted by structures outside ourselves. So simulations serve not only to decrease empathy for disabled people, but to increase ableist perceptions, ideas, and values. And that research, while specifically has been done on the concept of disability simulations, no doubt is broadly applicable to any form of supposed empathy building exercise designed primarily for privileged, resourced, powerful people about other experiences of marginalization.
I wholly agree with all that. And I think you both raised a really important point. And I just want to circle back on it because I think the natural reaction, especially since it's a cool new technology, is to have the VR do the heavy lifting and to make that be the proposed solution. And I think the heavy lifting has to be done outside of the VR. It has to be done, as an example for the trainings that we do. The VR is there to simulate the scenarios, but the actual training, the reflection and the analysis happens after the VR, where we play it back and have officers reflect on why they chose certain courses of actions. Like that's where the intervention is. I don't know that the VR is where the intervention should be placed or the onus of where the intervention should be placed. And I think, if the goal is attitudinal and behavioral changes, we just have to be really careful to not be too reliant on the technology when that was never really the intention of the technology. Like it can't do what we want it to do.
Great, thank you all. I could just talk about empathy interventions for the rest of this panel, but I do want to touch on a couple more points before we go on to audience questions. One of the things I want to talk about is, in addition to using these devices for equity and inclusion, there's also the question of equity and inclusion from and in these devices, if we're using them, for example, in educational or workplace settings, or even for things like public services or government. How do you think developers, as well as implementing organizations and institutions, should be approaching inclusive design in AR/VR to make sure that as many people as possible can actually reap the benefits of these technologies? Long, let's start with you on this one.
I think the biggest barrier is access. Like it's, assuming that this is all good and it's doing more good than harm, and assuming that it leads to positive changes. So setting all that aside, I think if we truly believe that this has the potential to increase empathy or to lead to attitudinal or behavioral changes, or is a useful tool, they're still really difficult to get access to. It's not like a computer where even if you don't have access personally, there are like publicly available places where you can get access. A VR headset is expensive, it's cumbersome, it requires technological aptitude that a lot of the general population, or even folks who are like generally competent at computers or whatnot, don't have access to. So I think, making sure that this technology gets out to the people who need to experience it is a major hurdle that is going to be difficult to deal with in the short term, at least, because even for an R1 university, it took us lots of fundraising and grant writing to get the technology in the lab to even begin developing it. So, having that be extended to the general public is going to be a tougher solution.
Lydia, you alluded to some of this in your opening remarks. Do you have any thoughts on how we should be approaching the concept of inclusive design in these technologies? And if Lydia does not, Courtney, do you have thoughts? Okay, great.
This is Lydia. People ask me often about challenges that disabled people experience with technology. Number one, many technologies are designed inaccessibly to disabled people. Number two, many technologies do not account for the ways that disabled people's bodies and minds work. And the only way to account for that is to actually involve disabled people as equal decision-making partners from the beginning. from the design to the research, the development phase, let alone the deployment and use phase. And I will note too that we have very particular concerns. Number one, will AR or VR technologies successfully be able to identify disabled people as people in the same ways that we already know that automatic self-driven cars have trouble recognizing people with baby strollers, have trouble recognizing people with small children or animals, and for many disabled people who use wheelchairs or might be little people, will we be recognized? What about those of us who might have atypical looking faces, or those of us in our communities that communicate manually using sign languages, or those of us who use other forms of mobility equipment occasionally or sporadically rather than as a general rule? Or do the interfaces enable us to actually use the technology? Do they enable us to be recognized by the technology? And do they enable us to be using the technology on a level playing field with non-disabled people? Because if the answer to any of those questions is no, then those technologies aren't meaningfully available to us.
So another point that I want to bring us to before we go on to audience questions is, we talked about empathy and some of the considerations about that. Let's talk about some of the other considerations that developers, policymakers, and implementing organizations should keep in mind when we're thinking about AR, VR in DEI. The first thing I'm wondering is, how do you think, quote unquote, real world bias and discrimination and other issues that we're trying to address could translate into immersive experiences or could be exacerbated by immersive experiences? And how should organizations address this? Courtney, let's throw this one to you first.
Could you repeat the question, Ellysse?
Yeah, absolutely. How could real world bias manifest in immersive experiences or from immersive experiences? And how should we address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think going to a point that Lauren made earlier, we need to be careful about what we think VR is capable of doing, and not. I mean, I think we want to be innovative and we want to be creative, and also not place too much weight on what VR is capable of. I think part of what we've tried to do in the VR that we created is to help you see the ways in which these experiences of racism immerse from very early in life and kind of across the life course and kind of across different contexts, and try and show you some of those realities. And again, some of the work that we're doing now is trying to help visualize some of the ways in which these issues function in systems. So I think there's a lot of possibility, but we again, we just want to be careful about how much we think VR is capable of in this space, and think very strategically about what we're doing in the headset and out of the headset. And I think to one of the points that was made earlier in relation to your question now, Ellysse, is the teams that we put together to create content are critical, right? We can't assume someone who doesn't have and has never lived with a disability could possibly have insights into creating meaningful content in this space. And so you can't just sort of feel bad about an issue or think that an issue is important and have good intentions, and that actually be able to drive you to something meaningful in terms of what you produce, in terms of the hardware, in terms of the software content, etc. So I think the processes that we engage and the people we engage in how we're creating this work becomes quite critical in determining whether we're going to reach a meaningful landing point in what it is that we're producing.
And I'll add to that. I think, not only should we be mindful of, our team members and the people creating the VR content, but they really should be equal and valued stakeholders. And stakeholders in the sense, in the way that they're able to push back when certain proposed solutions or proposed designs are difficult to implement. Like there's, a lot of times, especially, in my experiences with dealing with coders and stuff, it's like, there's a systematic way of thinking of how to get from point A to point B very efficiently in terms of amount of time and resources. But, that may not necessarily produce the best product that is representative of the experiences that we're trying to create. And having team members who are able to convince the rest of the team that this is worth investing time and resources and energy into getting it right is just as valuable. And if you're, it's one of those cascading problems where, just because you have somebody in the room, if they don't feel like they can speak their mind, or if they don't feel like they can contribute and have their contributions taken seriously, it's not going to do anything. So that's another piece that I think is important, just empowering the people who are actually in the room to make the suggestions that need to be made.
Great. So we have quite a bit of different people attending our discussion today. RightsCon is bringing together so many different communities and experts. I want to talk a bit about how we actually bring some of these great suggestions that you all have into practice. So in your experience and your opinion, what role should policymakers, industry leaders, developers, civil society, what role should they play in implementing or operationalizing some of these considerations in AR/VR, whether we're talking about using it as a DEI training tool or as just a general tool that exists in our daily lives in the future?
I think building on a point that Long was just making is, this is not a nice to have in terms of, do we have diverse representation in the room creating content? I would argue that it's dangerous to not have these perspectives in the room, that we're going to create massive harm as a result of not having these voices at the table as we're producing the technology in various forms. I think it's critical. And I think policymakers really have to understand, and I think related to Long's point, we have to kind of remove the hierarchy. It's not cute to have someone who has a disability at the table. It's essential to have them. They're just as important as the computer scientists. They're just as important as a programmer to have at that table in terms of determining the kind of level our playing field, and so to speak, in terms of what perspectives are really critical in order to prevent harm. And then the second point that I would add in terms of applying this to practice is really making a distinction between ethics and justice. So ethics really speak to preventing harm in the future. Justice also speaks to repairing the harms that have already been caused, the things that we've already done that have harmed various communities. And we need to be thinking about the responsibilities of these technologies to repair some of the harms that they have created with their own technologies, and their potential to repair harms that they didn't necessarily create, but could do something about. And so I think taking that responsibility is pretty critical. And so when I talk about these issues, it really focuses on what is the process by which we are developing, creating, and applying technologies, who's at the table, becomes essential to doing a good job at this. And good intentions and being a good person is not sufficient to actually be effective at having meaningful, positive social impact.
Lydia, what about you? How do you think we could, or different actors and stakeholders should be approaching the use of AR/VR in DEI?
This is Lydia. I think that actors need to be very careful and deliberate about what their aims are. What is your goal? How are you going to measure that goal? And how exactly do you think AR/VR technologies will bring you closer to that goal? If you can't articulate clearly what it is that you are planning to do, then it's not about actually advancing equity. It's about window dressing. If you can't name who the people are for marginalized communities that had a decision-making role in the development of the technology and the plan for how to use it, then it's not about equity. It's about window dressing, about the ability to claim that you've done something to address inequity without actually putting in the work to do it. And if you were using technology of any kind, AR/VR or any other form of technology, to say, this is how we are advancing equity with no other work being done, a bit about what Courtney was talking about earlier. There's been no change in behavior, no change in actions, no change in policy, no change in general practices, then you're not using the technology to advance equity, you're using it as window dressing. You're using it as a substitute for doing the real work of justice.
All right, long list to get to you, and then I'm going to move on to questions from the audience. So make sure that you drop those in the chat if you have them.
Yeah, so I wholeheartedly agree with both Lydia and Courtney's points. I think to revisit one of your earlier questions about, potential downsides of this, the work, there's a lot of work that needs to be done outside of the technology. And I worry that because it's a cool new technology and because it has so much potential that that certain stakeholders are very excited about it and, think that pouring money into it is going to solve the problem. And in some ways it helps well, it doesn't help. In some ways it shifts the focus to an individual level at changing individuals' hearts and minds, and it removes the focus from structural and policy solutions. And I think we have to not lose sight of that as we're developing these technologies. So, it's VR and AR, I think, has a lot of potential, but until we can fully articulate what that potential is, I think there are lots of tried and true methods in terms of addressing systemic and structural issues that we should also devote just as much time and attention to. And to only have this narrow view or singular focus on advancing VR technology can be detrimental in the long term.
Great, thank you, everyone. So let's move on to some audience questions. Let's go to this one first. Someone asks, what are the advantages of using AR/VR for DEI compared to traditional media? And are there any disadvantages? Long, let's start with you on that one.
Yeah, so I promise I wasn't making my last point by reading that question. But, I think the primary advantage from my perspective is it's a more immersive technology than traditional media. Like, you can watch a video, you can read, and you can empathize based on that. But it requires a lot more visualization and imagination using traditional media. When you are fully immersed and there's an audio, a visual, and there's even VR technology that creates physical sensation, when it's fully immersive like that, I think it's a lot more powerful and it will be more successful at generating emotions than traditional forms. To Courtney's earlier point, we have to be careful and be intentional about what the emotions are that we're trying to produce in people, and not just create this scenario where you're sad at the end of it and then what. So I think that's the primary advantage, and to the extent that we can harness that and use it to push towards positive changes, that's speaks volumes to the strengths of VR.
Courtney, do you have anything to add on that? I know this is pretty relevant to your work as well.
Yeah, I think this goes back to, a point that both Long and Lydia have been making in their comments is the window dressing component, right? The symbolism, right? We can't get overly invested in what we think it's doing and what we hope it's doing, right? We have to be very careful about what it's actually doing. Sometimes we put someone in experience, as Lydia referenced earlier, and we actually produce more bias toward that group or more negative feelings toward that group as a result of putting them headset, in spite of our intention of creating something different. And so I think we have to be really careful about our measurement and what are we measuring to give us a sense of what the actual outcomes are in these kinds of experiences. But that said, I think VR is quite powerful in being able to transport you into experiences and places and have you occupy experiences and perspectives that we couldn't produce for you realistically any other way. And I think the more that we, again, keep bringing diverse voices and perspectives into this space, we'll really start to push and understand the possibilities of VR. What I hope doesn't happen is that we get into a mode of, oh, first person point of view, you're this person and this thing is happening to you, and we only stay in that space. I hope we keep pushing and our creativity and innovation around what's possible in virtual reality, because for me, the landscape is wide open. We just need to be creative in how we're approaching it and really examining what's possible. So I think even what we know right now is possible is quite powerful. And then I think there's an additional power of VR that we might tap into, but we're just really going to have to move beyond people who have a background in tech and move into people who have expertise, either personally or professionally, in lived experiences and understand humanity in various ways, and make sure that they're a part of how we're exploring how to use VR in order to really tap into its potential.
Yeah, Courtney, I mean, I think that's what makes VR so exciting, is it's an entirely new medium. And like you said, we don't even know everything that it's capable of doing yet. And I like to think that if we do approach it ethically and intentionally, like you all have said, hopefully we can build something that's completely new and unique and could have a real impact in this space. Long, there was a question that was just for you, but perhaps others have thoughts on the process of this as well. Someone wants to know if the police trainings you mentioned were done prior to officers interacting with civilians, or if they're done during their career. And if you have administered the trainings pre and during tenure, do you feel like one time is more beneficial than the other? And maybe I'll just broaden this, what is the ideal point of entry for these kinds of immersive experiences? Who is the audience for, the ideal immersive empathy or perspective taking experience?
So I'll start with a specific answer and then I'll get more like philosophical, I guess. So specifically, these trainings that I was talking about earlier were done as officers are in the field. So they've been in the field. This is not academy training. We have done some academy training as a team, and in some ways it's better, and in other ways it's not. Like, I think you get more cooperative participants in some respects in the academy before they're in the field, and you get the real world experiences that they bring from the field to the trainings with officers who are during their tenure. But more broadly, I think it's tough to say which is more beneficial, because I think in order for any sort of training to be beneficial, it needs to be ongoing and it needs to be frequent, because as most fields have continuing education for the same reason, right? Like, you can get a useful bit of training or whatever, but if you don't continue to practice it and hone it, you lose it over time. So I think ideally any sort of VR training that we would implement happens early and it happens often. Obviously, resources will constrain that, but we're speaking in ideal terms at this point.
Lydia or Courtney, do you have any other thoughts on, what's the ideal entry point or way to introduce these kinds of interventions?
I definitely feel like when you're creating whatever it is you're creating in VR, you need to be very clear about your target audience and not just have the blanket sense that you're trying to target everyone. And I think you need to consider their ideologies, the schemas that they use to make sense of the issue that you're talking about, and take that into consideration as a very specific point of intervention. You need to understand the audience that you're speaking to. I would also say that when we're thinking about training in VR, I like to make the point that you can't skip to training and soft skills if you haven't changed the container that you're pouring that training into. So if they don't understand the significance and relevance of why you're engaging these issues, if they don't have any real substantive sense of why DEI is important to begin with, or why we're talking about a particular issue, there's no amount of training that's actually going to function well in relation to that. So I think part of how we can imagine using VR is, can I help shift your worldview? Can I help shift your understanding of substance as it relates to these particular issues, whatever it is that you're addressing, before we get into this is what you do when you're in a particular situation type of VR trainings.
Great. And Lydia, I would love to get your perspective on this as well, because I know you have a lot of concerns about these kinds of interventions. Where do you think is a good entry point or audience for this kind of work?
This is Lydia. I want to see more conversations among number 1, developers of technologies, number 2, purchasers and users of technologies, and number 3, regulators and policymakers who are setting guidelines for what we can and cannot do. And I want those conversations to center the perspectives of people who've been multiply marginalized, especially disabled people of color, disabled people in queer and trans communities, disabled people in immigrant communities of color, for example. And I want those conversations to be oriented toward ensuring not just non-discrimination, but move toward more equitable and just outcomes. And that's also why I need to very specifically call attention to another aspect of the conversation that is often difficult to name. The vast majority of the time that disability comes up in conversations about technology, it is in the context of accessibility. Is this technology accessible? Can disabled people use it? Now, that is a vital and necessary question to ask, because most of the time the answer is no. Technologies are not accessible and are not functionally usable for many disabled people at all, for a variety of reasons. But more than that, questions of how we use technologies, what they do, both for disabled people and for non-disabled people, and what happens when we use them, those are questions of discrimination and questions of justice and injustice. These are questions of people's civil and human rights. If technologies are used to make decisions that affect people's lives, that affect individual people's safety, whether that's an automated car deciding whether or not to proceed and go forward, or whether that's a predictive policing system deciding which people should be investigated or which people should be subjected to police questioning. In all of those situations, the questions that we're dealing with aren't just those of accessibility, they're about rights and they're about justice. And when we talk about disability, that's the conversation that I want everyone to be having.
Fantastic. I think that's a great spot to close it out. So thank you so much to Long, Lydia, and Courtney for this incredible conversation. This technology is still really in its early stages, and we don't have a full concept of what it can do, but also the harms it can cause. So I think these kinds of conversations are absolutely critical at this stage. Also, big thanks to RightsCon for hosting this discussion, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the XR sessions, and I hope to see some of you there. Thank you so much.